A Cricketing View, an irregular podcast about cricket and other things. Episode 6. This is the second part of my conversation with Daniel Norcross of Test Match Special. Our conversation begins with a discussion of Ben Stokes, Patrick Cummins, and a few other players. We discussed India briefly, and we discussed what cricket might look like in the 2020s. Ben Stokes is also a once-in-a-generation talent, isn't he? I mean, he just keeps getting better every year. But do you know what? Okay, let me ask you a question, right? How many players do you think have made more than 441 runs in a 5-test series?
How many players ever?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I would have imagined a fair few, I suppose. Over 20, I would have thought.
271. Ben Stokes is the 271st batsman to make 441 plus runs in a 5-test series. Okay, that's over 160 years of test cricket. But
Right, yeah.
whereas Jofra Archer, only 63 bowlers have taken 22 or more wickets in a 4-test series, which is the number of tests he played.
Yeah.
And very few of them has done it in their first series. So that sort of puts into perspective sort of the difference in the two series performances.
Yeah, quite definitely. I mean, that's if you see Ben Stokes' contribution as a batsman only. I mean, I'd be interested to know how many wickets did he take in the series?
Not that many, I think.
No, I suppose not. But you've got to take into account what he does with the ball, what he gives to the balance of a side. Look, I mean, Stokes' raw numbers aren't that exciting, are they? They're reasonable. What does he average? About 34 with the bat and about 33 with the ball. It's in that kind of ballpark, isn't it?
Yeah, that combination is actually quite good. I mean.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He averages like somewhere just above 2 wickets a test match, which is good for a fifth bowler. Stokes has this ability like Archer. He never looks like he's bowling in hope. There's a clear plan. He's either trying to hit the wicket hard and, bounce the batsman out by bowling cross seam, or he's trying to float it out there and hope to sucker the batsman into an edge, or he's trying to, pin the batsman on the pads with a. I mean, it's not subtle. The plan is obvious, but there's always a plan.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, there is something obviously Stokes both gets cricket and gets his position in it. So I think it's important for a player in order for them to clear their mind and be able to perform at their best is for them to sort of know what their role is and what they're doing there and why they're there, I mean, it's like doing any job. When you go in to do my job, I sort of know the kind of person I'm supposed to be. I mean, it's me, basically. I've chosen me, but you to do what I do, but you do what you do, with confidence, and that makes your life a lot easier. He's been playing cricket for England for really quite a long time, so his trajectory is not like Ian Botham's, for example, which was to arrive slightly assisted by the circumstances of the Packet era in the late 70s and some quite modest batting sides coming up against him, I grant you. But he probably bowled as well in the first 4 years of his career. Well, he definitely did. He bowled far better in the first 4 years of his career than he ever did afterwards.
Yeah.
With Stokes, you've got a slightly different trajectory, haven't you, in which he's learned cricket on the job and was a bit more showing flashes of ability in his youth, and is now an entirely rounded cricketer who understands what his role is in the team and what it is that he can do, and is passionately believing that, with plenty of confidence, that he can go out there and do that. And you're right, and that manifests itself as a certitude, excuse me, in what he does. I mean, he's still prone to error. All batsmen are, aren't they? I mean, he played the worst shot of the innings in the debacle at Headingley when England were bowled out.
And then
bowled his worst spell as well.
And then couldn't put a foot wrong. Like everything he tried came off in that fourth innings.
Well, yes. I mean, it was one of those extraordinary things. But for him, it was genuinely a game of two halves because he bowled abysmally in the first innings, letting Australia off the hook after they were in all sorts of trouble before lunch, and then batted terribly, and then actually bowled really well and batted really well. So, I mean, it shows a kind of resilience, I suppose. So he didn't lose his confidence. But then, he's an alpha male within that group as well. And I think, when you're in a working environment, if you're confident about your position within a team or where you're at, then you're more likely to flourish and you're more likely to be able to take risks. His innings at Headingley, which is the one that I suppose is the standout individual innings, people will say. I mean, I still argue that probably Steve Smith's first century in the first test at Edgbaston was the most complete innings of the summer for me.
Yeah.
But that innings at Headingley was, again, it felt to me a product of T20 in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a way that very similar to the Sri Lankan guy whose name's suddenly
Kusal Pereira.
Yes. Did exactly the same thing to Dale Steyn. When faced with a very similar target with 9 wickets down, the attitude of mind was, well, if I hit a 6, a 4, and a 1, and get 11 in each over, then I can get to 78 in 7 overs, crudely speaking, and try and leave my number 11 only facing 7 balls, which is a terrific clarity of mind, isn't it?
But you got to be able to do it, which these guys are. Which is
you've got to be able to do it. But you see, I mean, someone said to me about T20, which once there was a coach who said, it's not that they couldn't have done it in 1981. It's that they never tried to do it and were never asked to do it. Yeah. If you try to do it and you do it, then you realise that you can do it. It's like when Joss Butler practices. Sometimes he'll practice hitting the same ball round the clock face. He'll imagine where the field is set, and he'll try and hit it into the imaginary gap. Time and time again. Now, that is a way of training that nobody did in the 1980s. Graham Fowler, a good friend of mine, professed to being astonished by watching the way Butler set up in a net. Not in a bad way, in a way that's just that he would never have thought to do. You had certain shots to play to certain balls. Yeah. Whereas nowadays, the question being asked of a batsman is, how many shots have you got to the same ball? Because as a captain, I can place a field anywhere. So how are you going to score a 4 off it? Yeah. And in a way, that's what Stokes was doing in towards the back end of that innings, wasn't he? He was looking around the field and going, right, that's the one place where I could just about get it over the infield for a 6 or for a 4 or whatever. So that's the shot I've got to play. And yeah, you're right. You've got to be able to then to do it. But you've got to practice doing that in the first place. Yeah. In order to make that possible. And no one would have thought to have practiced that. Alan Border and Jeff Thompson took, I don't know how many, you'll be able to find out for me, but I would think it was about 25, 30 overs when they were 9 wickets down facing England at Melbourne in 82-3.
Yeah.
Trying to get 78 or so to get them over the line. Because the way Border saw it was, we've got all the time in the world. I'll get a single at the end of each over, the 4th or 5th ball of the over. Tomo will have to face 1 or 2 balls, and then I'll face again, and we'll just grind this out. Whereas Stokes took a different approach, which is it's too great a risk for Leach to face 15 balls. I've got to get us there before he does. It's a totally different mindset.
Yeah, but when it comes off, it's extraordinary. I mean, it seems to me that Stokes and Butler, especially those two, are like, in India, there's this idea, you always, you see patterns in the way players are selected. And then there's a category of player who's basically, they look at a player who's like 17 or 18 and they say, wow, this guy is definitely too good to be playing first class cricket. He's definitely, India quality. And even if that person is raw, they would fast track him. It happened It happened to Tendulkar most famously. It happened to Yuvraj Singh in 2000, when Yuvraj Singh was far from the finished, polished batsman. It's happened to Prithvi Shaw last year. I think, when you see Stokes and Butler, it seems that they're that kind of player. They've got so much basic ability that it's like the selectors think, oh, well, it's worth investing in these guys. Let's see what can come out at the other end.
It's the evidence of your eyes, isn't it? I remember commentating for Test Match Sofa in 2013, and David Fulton used to play for Kent and is now a broadcaster on Sky. And he said, Ben Stokes, you watch out for Ben Stokes. He's extraordinary. I asked him to explain why. He saw him reach his first class 100 with a 6 for Durham, and he got this 100 in not very many balls. I don't know for sure. 110, 120, something like that.
Yeah.
So he showed a sort of nervelessness, which isn't always apparent, is it? I mean, if you're a young cricketer, every step that you make on the progression towards your goal, which is to play for your country, must bring with it a certain amount of pressure. So, you want to get your first class 100, and you'd be forgiven for being a little bit, anxious on your way towards that goal. He said he saw nothing of that. There was just an owning of the stage. There was a complete certainty about the purpose and a cleanness of the hitting, obviously, and a beautiful hands and a great timing of the ball, which you need. And he was convinced. He said he's the best, young cricketer he'd ever seen. And people talk similarly about Jos Buttler. I mean, you talked to Vic Marks about the first time he saw Jos Buttler, and it's the evidence of your eyes when you see somebody being able to hit a ball that cleanly, that far, without that apparent effort.
Yeah,
that is what makes you think that something's special. And I felt like that when I saw Prithvi Shaw. I thought, wow. I mean, so you can understand why people fast track them. Obviously, at that point, a lot is going to depend on the person then, because
whether they make it or not is many other things are in play with that question. Our last player in this conversation, Pat Cummins, is another of those. I mean, he played for Australia when he was 18. He broke into an Australian side which had Mitchell Johnson at his peak, and Ryan Harris. So that was that era in Australian cricket was quite a strong side to break into.
Well, he was, for me, I mean, notwithstanding Archer, he was. Is he the most complete bowler I saw? I don't know if I'd go that far. What I would say is that he bowled the spell, I think, of the summer for me at Old Trafford. I don't think he took a wicket. I think he went 8 overs wicketless, and then a wicket fell. Obviously, the first ball of the following over, or the over he was taken off, as often happens. But he was fast, controlled. He didn't move it in an exaggerated way. For example, Pattinson tended to move it like too far. Sometimes just swing it too far and get exaggerated movement, and it looked fantastic. It reminded me a little bit of Stephen Finn when he was at his best. Often it would look more threatening than it was. With Cummins, it was just a masterclass. I can say I was standing right behind it, and it was 8 overs of pure, relentless venom and genius that was spread out over an hour. And he just feels like the complete bowler to me, because it's like a sort of fast McGrath, if you know what I mean. I mean, an 85 mile per hour McGrath was tough enough, or 83 mile now, but a 90 mile per hour McGrath is just a horrific prospect to face. And again,
he's averaging 5 wickets a test at 21 each.
It's absurd, isn't it? And I mean, a lot of this again comes down to intelligence, game intelligence, and thought. I don't know to what degree not playing because of all those injuries after he was 18 made a difference. I don't know whether he had more chance to ponder, perhaps. I mean, I know he took himself off and did a degree, didn't he? And graduated relatively recently. So he's clearly somebody who's capable of learning and being tested in these situations.
And there's extraordinary maturity in his bowling, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. I mean, he was the guy that had to be picked in every game. And when you look at the lineup that they had with Stark and Pattinson and Siddle and Nisa in the background and Hazelwood, for heaven's sake, who's a fearsome prospect. I was out on the outfield doing the pre-match build-up.
A classy bowler.
Really incredible. And, Stark and Hazelwood were both warming up from the pavilion end at Old Trafford, and I was standing no more than about 12, 15 feet away. And Stark was wanging it in, and I thought, oof, wouldn't like to face that. But at the same time, I sort of could imagine in my mind how you would play it.
Yeah.
And then Hazelwood was bowling alternate balls and pitching it on a similar length, and it was rearing horrible around about, breast to throat height.
Yeah.
He's a big guy, incredibly muscular. He changed his length this summer in England so that he got the right length, a better length than he bowled when he was here 4 years ago. So for Cummins to be the one who is ever present in that lineup just tells you how much they rate him. But we didn't need them to pick him for us to know, did we? He's just one of those guys who, again, the evidence of your eyes, you see it, and he's going to be a handful. And very, very, very occasionally, he kind of lost it once, and that was at the back end at Headingley, when all the Australian bowlers lost it against Stoke Onslaught. And there was just a moment when they tried to do things different. The field went back, which I always think is a little bit of a mistake. Myself, very hard for a captain to do, but they didn't.
Yeah, you're right. Because that's and that's where Cummins reminds me so much of Stain. Where when that sort of thing happens, both their instinct has always been to just relentlessly attack to try and blast the batsman out. Stain famously did that against McCullum in the World Cup semi-final of 2015. And McCullum, of course, will never take a backward step. And it came off on McCullum that day. But I've seen Stain do that a few times, and I've seen Cummins do that a few times. But most of the time, it's like you watch them bowl, and every now and then they hurry the batsman, and I find that really, mesmerizing to watch. It's like every now and then a ball will just sort of fly off the pitch. A little bit quicker, and Hazelwood has this different thing where the ball always really looks really small in his hand, almost as if it's like he can spin it, which is they're all very different bowlers, which is another sort of interesting thing, because I've seen Australian attacks in the past where all the bowlers were sort of similar.
They were very, very distinct, weren't they? And it's not about whether your action's right arm over or not, really. It's about what you do with the ball and off the pitch, and at what pace and what length you're trying to bowl. And I suppose the height as well at which you bowl, which is something that you get a feel for when you're at the ground a little bit more easily than when you're watching on TV, because that obviously determines the trajectory of the ball off the pitch.
Yeah.
And the height that Hazelwood bowls, for example, is fearsome. It's what makes him virtually impossible to get away. He could bowl at 1.5 and over for spell after spell. Simply because he's hitting the splice of the bat time and time again. I mean, it was a truly wonderful summer for that to watch those two bowling lineups against each other on those surfaces. It was really, deeply entertaining in a way that it sort of took me back a little bit to watching West Indian sides in the 80s, where, again, they would have 4 right-arm bowlers so totally different. Holding, Marshall, Roberts, Croft, Garner. Really, really different bowlers, different heights, different angles that are coming in at, which made a kind of relentless challenge to the batsman, you know.
Do you think there's a chance, Jofra Archer getting new audiences into the game? So the West Indian diaspora, for instance? Because that's been a presence in English grounds when West Indies play, right?
Yeah.
But less so otherwise.
Circumstances are very different now. I would love that to be the case, and I'm very hopeful of it. I think it's very important that, especially the way Britain is going at the moment, that that there are a bunch of different looking people playing for England. I mean, England is essentially Britain in this context, and Britain was an imperial nation, and as a result, it should reflect that. And in Archer, it does. I think the problem with the West Indian diaspora is that actually what you were watching in the 70s and early 80s were a large number of people who were first generation British who had come over in the 50s and 60s. And so the West Indian team was a great expression of pride for them. And they would come along and watch because their lived experience was not the best always. There was plenty of racism around, and their prospects for jobs and what have you were lower, at least not as good. So being able to go and support the West Indies, who were terrific, was a place where they could feel proud and supported. Now that space is far more in the world of football, where there are a bunch of
Sterling and all that generation.
Well, and it's been happening for
even before that, right? I mean, you go back to like John Barnes and other players in the 80s, and that was already
exactly. I mean, you go back to Viv Anderson in the late 70s for the first black footballer, and since then, I mean, what's also really pleasing in the England team is just the number of mixed race people that play for England as well, which is. Hopeful.
I must mention your favorite player, John Fashanu.
Turning circle of QE2. Old Bash the Bash,
Thunderous striker,
Thunderous, yes, powerful, and quite a dirty player, but I liked him. I loved him all the more for it, as he played for my team. Excuse me. So, I mean, I think that's going to be a more fertile area, but that doesn't mean to say that Jofra won't ignite interest in the Afro-Caribbean community. But cricket needs to do more than just rely on a poster boy. I mean, that's not how infusing different sections of the population works, just by putting somebody up and saying, oh, look, here's somebody black. You're black. You can play cricket for England. You need to create the structures in place that empower people and make them want to participate, and that goes far more deeply into schools cricket and grassroots cricket and club cricket, which is still predominantly the preserve of middle class white people, and the atmosphere in a club afterwards. If you go back to a clubhouse when you're 14, 15, and there's a bunch of old white guys talking about, do you remember, Binky Stevens and when he got that 35 against Old War Countians 25 years ago, then you'll probably go off and find your mates and you won't hang around for a drink. So, it's a bit more complicated, I fear, than that. It would be lovely if Jofra was a magic bullet, but I don't think he is. But I think he's a necessary step in the...
the iconography matters, isn't it?
It does, yeah. I mean, the phrase "you can't be what you can't see" is a powerful one, and it's a strong one, and it's and I totally go along with it.
Because I'll tell you, this is not just about England. It's happening right now in India as well. There's this whole move. Virat Kohli said that we should have only 5 test venues, and that's sort of, it seems to me, a regressive thing, because when I was born, cricket in India was a purely metropolitan sport. It was, certain parts of Bombay and certain parts of Madras, as it was then, and certain parts of Bangalore and certain parts of Delhi. and certain other princely, or ex-princely states.
And
That was it.
Calcutta, presumably, yeah.
And Calcutta, yeah, and Calcutta. And, before independence, it was, the princes who funded the game. And after independence, it was the big corporations who always happened to have their head offices in the big cities who funded the game. And the idea of having a test match at Ranchi, where Dhoni comes from, it's not only a signal, but it's a symbol of an expansion, which is just completely necessary in India. And it's not going to happen just by pointing to Dhoni and saying, oh, look, now people from, beyond the metropolises can play for India. No, it's not going to happen because of that. Munaf Patel came from a village. Mohammad Shami comes from a village. The tradition is that all these players move to the city because there's some, supportive club which takes them in. And, some of them make it, but there are others who have sort of emerged outside the big city.
What's Kohli's thinking? I mean, I saw that and I didn't really.
I don't know.
Understand where he's coming from.
To be fair to him, it's not really sort of something he invented. I mean, there is a school of thought which says that, if Test cricket is to survive, it needs to be played before sort of roughly full houses. But there's evidence to suggest that whether people come to watch the game or not has nothing to do with, which town the ground is in. It has to do with how easy it is to get to the ground.
Well, that's
not easy in a lot of these places where the ground is like outside town.
This is absolutely correct. And even in a densely populated country like Britain, and it really is, I mean, it's not that far to get from one place to one cricket ground to another, but you even find that the grounds that are just that little bit more difficult to get to are that much less populated. The Ageas Bowl being an example, or Chesterley Street up in Durham, where they've sort of positioned grounds away from urban centres, whereas the Oval, it's never a problem because it's literally slap bang in the middle of London, and it happens to be 1 minute's walk from the nearest tube station. So you're right. It's very easy if what you want to do is get people to grounds. But I'm also not convinced necessarily that the survival of Test cricket is determined by a full house at Test cricket. I mean, and I know in England, I preface this with a caveat that Test cricket in England is the most thriving form of the game. I guess it's the one that has the most full houses. Yeah. But just anecdotally, and this is not anecdotally, factually, listenership on Test Match Special is vastly different in a Test match from a one-day international.
Right.
The World Cup final notwithstanding, one-day games will provide about a third of the listenership of a day of Test cricket because it's Test cricket has a prominence, has a meaning, it's part of the experience. If you're at work, you might tune into that Test match to find out what's going on in a way that you forget that England are playing the third of 5 one-day internationals against Pakistan in a bilateral series, which means nothing,
Yeah, they seem to be unable to sell bilateral series, as in create a story about them.
Yeah, well,
it's a weird thing.
Well, yeah, it is weird.
They don't struggle similarly with Test matches.
No, I don't really know the reason why entirely. I suspect that in part it's the way we report. The whole infrastructure around a Test match in England is that every major newspaper will send 3 reporters to it. So you will get a match report, you'll get a colour piece, you'll get a quotes piece. Yeah. It will probably be mentioned on the national news at the end of the day, And in the Test match, at the end of the second day, England closed on 47 for 6 in reply to whatever, That'll happen in a way that they won't necessarily mention the one-day international if there's other sporting events going on around it. It might just be a one-liner rather than something from it. So it could be that the whole media circus around a test match is what fuels that. I mean, that would be entirely consistent with how the media works in every other part of the world, in every other facet of the world. So it could be that. It could also be that we have always judged our players by their performances in Test cricket, until very, very recently. And look at Jason Roy. I mean, Jason Roy had an extraordinary. We barely talked about the World Cup, but Jason Roy and Johnny Bairstow were a remarkable double act at the top of England's order in that World Cup. And when Roy didn't play, England were in a bit of trouble. Roy and Plunkett, it's got to be said. And when they both played, England were a very different proposition, and they played this extraordinary form of cricket. And then Roy was brought into a test match, and it became instantly apparent that he wasn't up to opening the batting in a test match, certainly not playing the way he was playing.
Yeah.
And that means that Jason Roy is not thought of as a cricketer in the same way that Alistair Cook was.
Yeah.
Who were never going to win a World Cup for you. Alistair Cook was never going to win you a World Cup. Jason Roy sort of could win you a World Cup. And yet, Jason Roy is a long way down the pecking order, So, make of that what you will.
How far do you think we are from the first pure limited overs superstar? Not someone who derives not someone who derives part of their glory from being a great test player, but someone who's a pure white ball global superstar of the level of, say, Kohli or Smith.
I think we're still quite a long way away because white ball cricket still really exists in the consciousness properly only in global tournaments.
Yeah.
So it's got to be. I mean, even people who make it in IPL or Big Bash or the Blast or whatever, those performances are massively unseen by comparison with how they do in a World Cup. So, Ben Stokes' performance in a World Cup final could be a great performance because it was a World Cup final.
Yeah.
I think if Ben Stokes had got England over the line in that game against New Zealand at any point between now and the next World Cup, it would be barely mentioned at all. I mean, it would be a bit of a footnote, because there have been incredible innings in one-day cricket, which people got sides over the line. But, I mean, I struggle to remember them because my brain doesn't index them.
Rohit Sharma made 500s in the World Cup. And I can guarantee you that 10 years from now, people will remember his 300s against South Africa more than they will remember those 5 World Cup hundreds.
I agree. If he got 100 in the World Cup final, that would have been different. Because, I mean, that's my point. It's sort of, I think if you can do it at the very end of the tournament or in the semi-final, maybe you might just get away with it. Then that will linger. Yeah. But it won't linger in a group phase game. It certainly won't linger in a 3-match bilateral series. And even more so, I mean, England are about to play 5 T20s against New Zealand.
Wow.
Do you honestly think that even if Tom Banton, who's a very exciting young prospect at Somerset, even if he manages to fulfill Michael Vaughan's predictions that he's the closest thing he's seen to Kevin Peterson, even if he scores 120 in a match-winning cause against New Zealand in any of these 5 matches, that will be a momentary excitement, but it will be a stepping stone for him on the way to doing something that's way more notable.
Yeah.
And that may not be fair, but it is what it is, isn't it?
So the reason I asked you about one-day cricket is because I have this nagging theory in the back of my head that limited overs cricket needs to become a high volume sport, along the lines of baseball rather than a low volume sport along the lines of Test cricket or the NFL. And Freddie and Tim did make a compelling counterpoint to this, which is that in the age of TV, money is basically made by broadcasting these games. And so the problem with making it a high volume sport is that you can't then broadcast most of the games because you end up having to hold them at the same time.
Yes. Well, that is exactly the problem that the T20 Blasters had, and as
yeah,
a
result
in the 100.
The 100. Yeah, that was Freddie's explanation for the 100. That it came about because they wanted to reduce the number of teams, and this was a way of doing it without upsetting the counties too much.
Yeah, I mean it's not entirely complete, that, because my suspicion is that they could just as easily have created a 2-divisional T20 and televised only the first division.
That would have upset half the counties.
Well, not necessarily, because if there's a large amount of TV revenue that comes in, and you give a certain amount of that money to the 9 counties that are in the first division, but it's on the basis that they have to spend it on overseas players, and you give the same amount of money that's left over after that to all the other counties from the TV deal, then you could have created the spectacle that you require, and you could also have had promotion and relegation, which is a thing that's, I don't think it's peculiar to England, but it's something that British sport particularly likes. It likes the idea that you can dream, like Leicester City, of winning the Premier League, or Wimbledon of winning the FA Cup, by a series of miracles taking place over an amount of time. Yeah. Whereas having 8 teams that just compete for it the same way year after year is a not particularly British friendly way of doing it, and you have to create a bunch of different entities. But my personal view is that that the 100 has got actually some things going for it, which is that I think it is a way of trying to attract the kind of viewership that you were alluding to earlier when you talked about Jofra Archer. Having been to the World Cup this summer and seen so many people flock into games of cricket in England that do not go to domestic games or indeed to international games when their team isn't playing. Bangladesh played at the Oval a couple of times I was there. It was absolutely fantastic. The atmosphere was incredible. The Vauxhall End stand the OCS stand was shaking with excitement, and we're positioned commentary box just below the top of the stand, and those guys and women, there were whole families there, don't turn up to watch cricket in England usually, and the 100 may be a way of introducing those sorts of people into cricket and coming to watch it live, which is a really, really good thing. I'm just not sure that was necessarily the entire idea. These 8 entities are owned by the ECB, so they won't irritatingly vote on things in a way that counties do. And if you want to run an organisation along business lines, and let's face it, the people who run English cricket for the last 25 years have usually been plucked out of commerce, from Lord Maclaurin through Giles Clark and into Colin Graves. There's a sort of worshipping at the feet of retail, as if somebody who has run a board that runs a bunch of grocers knows exactly how to run cricket, because that's the way you run board meetings. In those board meetings, there's no dissent. Yeah. But of course, when you run cricket, you've got 18 counties, and the MCC and the minor counties have a vote, and heaven knows what else. So these people who've come from one environment then have to curate meetings that are very different from what they're used to, and they become deeply frustrated because they want to make change, and they are up against the vested interests of a lot of different people. So my concern is that maybe that level of representative democracy, as represented by the counties, is something that is not appreciated by the ECB, and they would rather have a greater control over their product. I say it's a concern. It might be wise, it might not, but you need to take that into account as well as the cricket before you make a judgment on why something's been done.
This is really the distinction, isn't it? That on the one hand, sport is about, and sport survives by creating these sort of local solidarities. And those solidarities are created over a generation or over, more than a generation, in fact.
Well, look at the
And
Ashes. Look
yeah,
at the Ashes.
and they exist because people like to play the sport, and that's why they play the sport. And so then you have to make some money to sustain it. But on the other hand, you have these corporate market shares. That's a whole other way of thinking about the audience, isn't it? And
Oh,
and I don't know how sustainable that is. I mean, is there any evidence that it is sustainable? The Americans never make this mistake. They have the same clubs for decades. And they do
yeah.
not. They do not. I mean, Major League Baseball does not. America has a population of 330 million now. They had a population of roughly 100 million 100 years ago. And there has not been a threefold increase in the number of Major League Baseball franchises.
No.
Franchises
No.
move from city to city, but they don't add new ones. They do have, they did some expansion, but that's like once in like 20 years or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's not how it's working, is it? It's not on the basis of the numbers of people.
No.
In part, it's the bandwidth that people can take in. Because if you suddenly got 120 teams, then the narrative gets really messy. Which is another reason why I totally understand why
the 100 aspects
to create. Yeah, well, it wants to create a tournament with fewer teams. This part I understand.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, I can see all sorts of very positive reasons why it's there. And the reason that I mentioned, which may be an issue, is only an issue if you believe firmly that you want to maintain the governance of English cricket involving 18 counties, which is quite a clunky way of reaching a consensus on moving forward and making any change. Although I would also add that English cricket, and I don't totally understand why this has happened, but English cricket introduced domestic one-day cricket in the early 60s.
Yeah.
It introduced Sunday League cricket in the 70s, early 70s. It ran 3 concurrent one-day tournaments while India was barely playing one-day cricket.
Yeah.
It hosted the first 2 World Cups. It invented the Women's World Cup. It created T20. So it's clearly a model that's agile enough to make change. So I'm not 100% convinced that the problem with English cricket is the clunky governance as represented by that many vested interests. So, I mean, I'm sort of talking around the point because I don't know what I feel about it.
Yeah, it does feel like everything is up in the air, and I'll tell you another area in which I found that the way I watch has changed. When I was growing up, there was this whole thing, when I first began to understand cricket, there was like this whole thing about technique and action, and technique was about footwork and the high elbow and playing the ball along the ground. And there was a correct technique and there was an incorrect technique. And if a batsman got out, you usually look for what incorrect thing the batsman did. Or if the bowler kept getting hit to square leg, you looked for what wrong thing the bowler was doing that he was kept getting hit. And
bowling too straight, playing away from your body if you're a batsman, allowing a gap between bat and pad, not moving your feet. Absolutely. I mean, these are things that were drilled into you as a kid.
And then around like the beginning of the 21st century, it changed, with like Trescothic and Sehwag and Graham Smith. And there was always, the Rahul Dravid and the Jack Calais and all those guys. But, and then, there was, Donald and all of these, Muralidharan, all of these idiosyncratic players began to come into play. And now the way I watch it, I've sort of come to see technique as a customized thing. that there are all these players and like the really, really outstanding great players who make it at the international level. They have like outstanding raw material, in the sense that they have a really, really terrifically cultivated eye, and they just have they're quick with their bowlers, or they can really spin the ball hard. But around that, they're working out all sorts of things in their own way. For instance, Pujara and Joe Root address the ball outside off stump in very different ways. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether that's just a change in me or that's a change in the game.
I don't know, actually. I mean, I would say that I don't think that everyone was homogenous, because the history of the game has always been the history of changes, hasn't it? I mean, you go back to someone like Ranji, opening up the leg side, and there was a general belief that the offside was the way you played it, and the leg side was agricultural or wrong in some way, and then Ranji managed to make the leg side a fashionable place to hit the ball. You look at old footage of WG and everything is about driving through the offside. And then you look at Bradman, then he took leg side play to an absurd, I say absurd, to a hugely effective place, didn't he? Where a bit like Smith, he's moving across his stumps and working the ball into the onside time and time again. It's exactly what Smith is doing.
Jardine.
Jardine deciding that these are the laws of the game, and you work within the laws, and you can open up the leg side in a different way.
But that was not so much. That was admittedly not so much a technical shift as a strategic shift. But
it requires a technical shift from the bowler, though, doesn't it? Because you're asking somebody who has been bowling right arm over the wicket like Larwood, who has been targeting probably the top of off stump. I mean, in those days, to get an LBW, you had to bowl wicket to wicket. You couldn't even pitch the ball outside off stump. So you've got somebody bowling a very, very different way from coming in round the wicket and spearing it in at someone's breast or heart. I mean, you're asking people whose techniques have been honed in one way to do something very different, which is a terrific change. But I think also, like the Jack Iverson, the mystery spinner, Bosanquet inventing the googly, and then suddenly you get actual googly bowlers. They're not even bowling leg spin; they're just bowling googlies. So the game has been in transition and has been about quirks, oddities forever. Because my theory is not a particularly profound one, Carter's, but it's that all sport, in order to really break a game open, if it's in a state of stalemate, is to create chaos.
Yeah.
You watch. I mean, any game is like this. You watch football and rugby. You're talking about teams of people who are highly trained athletes who have been doing the same things over and over and over again. What you have to do to break it open is to make something happen they're not expecting, which is why Shane Warne was so extraordinary, because no one had faced leg spin of anything like that quality. I mean, they'd had Abdul Qadir, but 10 years since Qadir was at his peak. So effectively, the people playing him hadn't seen anything like it. That's chaos. It's a little bit why Jofra Archer was able to do what he did, because those Australians hadn't faced somebody ambling in and then pinging the ball at their head at 95 miles per hour. That causes chaos. Yeah. And that's what Ben Stokes did at the end of Edgbaston. He took the Australians that thought they'd won the game. They only needed one more wicket, and he created chaos by suddenly smashing it over the boundary. And then that gets into the bowlers' minds, and they're thinking, where am I going to bowl it next? That's what you've got to do to break it up. Because if people are in a comfort zone and they're in a place where they're happy and they've been doing something they've been drilled to do, you're not going to get any. You're just going to butt up against each other. And in the 60s, they kind of did, didn't they? You had
that's a period which
slow scoring draws.
That's a period which I'm curious about in England, which is that in the 50s you had basically fast bowlers and spinners.
Yeah.
Right. And then in the 60s, and there's something in Colin Cowdrey's autobiography about this. The wickets changed, and you suddenly began to have seamers.
Yeah.
You know, that seems to have been an interesting shift, because now when we think about going to England, it's like, oh, green wickets, this, that, and the other. But in the 50s, it was probably not like that. You know, it was, oh, well, Jim Laker is going to get you, or, you know, you have to play, you know, Truman and Tyson and Statham and.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's made even more bizarre by the fact that, you know, one-day cricket had been introduced in, what was it, 62, 63? And yet it didn't seem to suddenly create a glut of fast-scoring batsmen. I mean, notwithstanding the occasional unusual outrider like Colin Milburn.
Yeah.
But it actually resulted in Ken Barrington scoring a terrific number of runs really quite slowly. A little bit like the panic that purists have that T20 is affecting everyone's technique.
Yeah.
It's never a simple correlation. There's never a cause and effect that works quite like that.
No.
There are so many other factors at play. There's the ball, the pitches, the circumstances, the captains, you know, the way that you structure a tournament. All those things will determine what cricketers do, because cricket is a gloriously complicated game, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so they don't just react. You know, it's very easy to take the example of Jason Roy and say, Jason Roy plays this way with his firm hands in front of his pad, and then you see him in a test match and he can't hack it against the moving red ball, and that tells you that white ball cricket has destroyed all opening batsmen's techniques.
That's a sort of a really, really self-serving point, isn't it? I mean,
it is, yeah. It is. And it's superficial, and it fails to understand, you know, correlation and proper cause and effect, and take into account all the myriad different, you know, motivating factors on a batsman, and you know, it's just wrong. It's ridiculously wrong. In the 60s is a perfect example of that, because you got Ted Dexter leading Sussex to one-day cup glory, and English players playing one-day cricket, way more experienced at it than any other country in the world, because all of their domestic players were playing it, and playing a load of it in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. And yet it didn't make them the best players in the World Cup, did it? You know, best team at the World Cup was the West Indies.
I find myself asking, like, well, what does the batsman think is possible here? And what is the batsman trying to achieve? And like, I was watching Rabada, and I didn't watch a lot of the series, but I did watch some of it, and I tried to like watch whenever Rabada was bowling. But he was able to, he was drawing the edge, and he was beating the bat, and on very good wickets, not very quick wickets. And it seemed to me that, you know, Rohit Sharma and all these other batsmen, they made a lot of runs, but against Rabada, they were living in hope, basically. You know, and it was sort of unfortunate for South Africa that, you know, there was nobody else at the other end, and sort of in the end, Rabada got snowed under, you know, by just the relentlessness of it all, you know, with no support.
This was an identical experience in a way to watching, firstly, Kohli against Anderson in England last year, and also the entire Australian team against Anderson in 2017-18.
Yeah.
Anderson, who's, I mean, I'm not going to get into it because it infuriates me. And not for nationalist reasons, just simply because I think James Anderson is one of those players that we should marvel and revel in when we get the opportunity to see what he does. But in Australia, on pitches that didn't suit him at all, in the 2017-18 Ashes series, he was played out, basically, by the batsmen. They tried nothing against him. Yeah. He went about 2 and over, if that. And he bowled long, unforgiving spells in relentless heat on flat decks. Yeah. And the Australians didn't try anything, and they waited for him to get off, and then they went after everybody else. And that's the joy of facing. It's not a one-man bowling attack, but in those kind of conditions, what Rabada represented was something akin to that. So, what the batsman does is looks at Rabada and goes, "Woo." He can only bowl 6 or 7 overs. It's only 36 to 42 balls, and then you revert to a kind of way of thinking that you probably had when you were a kid.
Yeah.
Whereas most of the rest of the time, these professional athletes don't think like us. They don't. I mean, I find it on commentary. Why don't we just see this guy off? Well, you can't just see Cummins, because after Cummins comes Hazelwood, and after Hazelwood comes Stark.
Yeah. And the South Africans didn't have any respite. I mean, when they were batting, it was like, there's Shami, and then you have to watch him, and then there's Umesh Yadav, and he finds a yard of pace from somewhere, and he's hitting the wicket, and he's getting it to rear up.
Let me ask you this: what has happened to Indian fast bowlers in the last 5 years, really, that has never happened in my lifetime before? How come there are so many? Is that a product of T20? Because it sort of feels like it in a way.
It's a combination basically of, I think, 3 things. The first is that the pool of players available to India has expanded significantly because the BCCI has invested money and the game has gone to places where it wasn't really there in say a previous generation. That's one thing. So the BCCI basic infrastructure, it creates opportunities for players to play. The second is that the support level, the support that they get now, trainers and therapists and all that, it has it goes down to a much lower level, and I think it has helped. And the third, I think, and this is something where I think Shastri especially has something to do with it, which is that when he came on in 2014, him and Kohli decided that they were going to chase 20 wickets and they were going to sacrifice batting to do that. And they spent a lot of time playing 5 bowlers. And in the beginning, they spent some time losing. But what that has done is that I think it has shifted attention away from batting in India. And
that intrigues me because
it was all about batting before. Batsmen were the people who gave you respectability. Previously, when I was growing up, when India played Test cricket, it was always about the batsman who would make 100 and prevent humiliation. It was not about being
Gavaskar, Vishwanathan, and Wengsake, yeah? And that was basically how, and a bit of Krishna Makari Srikanth at the top to make you feel kind of out.
Mohinder Amanath, and then of course Tendulkar and Rahul Dravid and all these people came along.
Yeah.
And it was sort of a chicken and egg thing, I think, to some extent. So that they played that way because they didn't really have the bowling, and they didn't really ever develop the bowling because they kept playing that way. This is something that I think Rahul Dravid and Greg Chappell did it in 2005 with the limited over side, and that really set India off on this dominant phase where they began to compete in a different way in the one-day game. Like there was a period in 2005 when Rahul Dravid basically, the problem then was that India couldn't chase, and this came with all its attendant, psychobabble about, they're not mentally tough for this, that, and the other. And that just drives me up the wall. But basically, Rahul Dravid, whenever he won the toss, he would choose to chase. And they kept chasing and eventually they got really good at it. Basically, since then, there's never been a period when, chasing has been a problem.
Yeah.
It changes something in the institutional memory of the national team.
Yeah.
And I think Kohli and Ravi Shastri, when he first came in that period, I think they changed that. And it definitely got India to lose a few games. I think in 2018, for instance, they played the five batsmen, and that definitely hurt them. I think for instance in England, if they had played 6 batsmen in somewhere, I think they would have won even by bowling fourth. It has changed the way India think about Test cricket.
Yeah, that intrigues me. I mean, yeah, my biggest confusion about Indian cricket is a really simple one, which is Ravindra Jadeja.
Yeah, he's a genius.
I have always seen him within Indian cricket as the obvious, well, second selection after Kohli.
Yeah.
You play him.
Yeah.
Come what may.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense that he doesn't play. I've seen you say vocally on Twitter, give me examples of when selectors have made ridiculous decisions.
Yeah.
Because I don't believe they exist. And I mostly agree with you on this. I really do, because I know exactly where you're coming from. But I have been perpetually baffled by why Jadeja will not have played 120 test matches by the time he's finished.
I think he's improved a lot. I think he's a different player in the last, say, 18 months compared to what he was before.
He was number one all-rounder in the world when he was, 2 years ago. When he came to England, he played the last test match. And that was the game when I thought India looked like they had the completely balanced team.
No, I agree. I think
he's around which it all works.
I think his batting is underrated.
But he's so adaptable.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing about him. He plays the situation. We've talked about this a lot in the last couple of hours, but adaptability, intelligence, cricketing intelligence. One of the reasons why we're both having this conversation for so long and that we know each other is because we're intelligent human beings who have other things to be getting on with in our lives, and yet cricket keeps on dragging us back into its orbit in a way that we cannot escape because it is seemingly endlessly fascinating.
Absolutely.
And the people who can understand the game and demonstrate their ability to understand it, and we've talked about a lot of them today, Archer and Smith and Cummins and Stokes, among many others, are the ones that so clearly excel in it. And Jadeja is...
And they're so easy to notice, isn't it? They're like,
so easy to notice. And Jadeja, to me, is one who absolutely gets it.
Yeah.
He gets cricket. He understands cricket. He understands what he's supposed to bowl when he's supposed to bowl it. Yeah. He adapts to pitches that are what they are. He changes his pace. He changes his length when he's bowling. He doesn't think that he's Tony Locke or Derek Underwood or, whatever. And then when he bats, he can either block the absolute living crap out of it, or he can hurtle at you, or he can do everything in between. I just see a cricketer,
He has that Archer-like thing where whatever he's trying, and even this is also true about Stokes, I think, is that whatever he's trying, whether he's trying to slog or whether he's trying to block, it doesn't look like something that's obviously foreign to him. I've seen batsmen who are very, very correct and very good at, playing long innings. And when they try to slog, you can just tell that, this is not going to work.
Joe Root
is
a perfect example of that.
They're not good at it. They don't know how to do it. They don't have a method. And with Jadeja, there's a method. Yeah. And there's also that absence of ego. I think what you said about Smith is absolutely true. He has no interest in sort of looking like a great spinner. He's not going to sort of wow you with, look at this swerve and look at the dip and look at the turn. He'll fire in 15 overs for you and give you 15 overs for 20 runs, and he'll do it. No problem, because it needs to be done, and he can do it. That's the amazing thing about it.
Exactly. I just think he's one of the most underrated cricketers of the last, since I've been watching. So, in answer to your oft repeated Twitter question, can you think of one selection that the selectors have got wrong? I'm telling you it now. I'm going on the record, Carters. It's that.
Yeah. Ravindra Jadeja should always play every time. I agree.
Correct.
I think at this point the case for that is overwhelming. I have to admit that.
Good.
So finally, Daniel, what do the 2020s look like? And we haven't even touched on Yasir Shah, who's stunning leg spinner, and Babar Azam, who's also, I think, going to be quite something in the 2020s. If we have this conversation 10 years from now, what will we have talked about?
Right. So to be really clear for listeners at home, by the 2020s, you mean the next decade, not the format of cricket.
No.
Firstly, on Babar Azam, I will back up that point with some quick-viz stats. There was a point during the World Cup in which he had a full shot percentage of something like 2%.
Wow.
His timing was off the scale. He's the most beautiful batsman, I think, in the world at the moment. Yeah. I know that's a purely subjective choice. What will the 2020s look like? It's a really good question. I genuinely have no idea. And the reason is because at the moment, the world is in incredible flux.
Yeah.
I have no way of telling whether we're going to continue down a path which will see more and more cricketers become franchise players playing T20 cricket around the world. I mean, I see, for example, structurally, someone like Mohamed Amir giving up Test cricket for all the right reasons. And I totally understand it. He works for a company, the Pakistan Cricket Board, that can't pay him, won't pay him to commit himself to them. And he's not got very many years left as a cricketer. And that situation is replicated around the world. It began with the West Indies when we started to see the likes of Dwayne Bravo and Chris Gale moving into this. So we may say that already that shadow has been lengthening over cricket, where really good cricketers are coming out of international cricket and moving into franchise cricket because that's where the money is. And I totally can see that is a possibility. And yet I can't see what will stop India, the BCCI, I should say, Cricket Australia and the ECB continuing to carve up bilateral international series between themselves and making lots of money out of them. So playing for your country will still be important in those three centres of excellence. I don't really see T20 leagues getting any more exciting. I look at the Big Bash and I see it actually atrophying slightly. They've overdone it. They've lengthened the tournament to the point when it became a bit boring, and I think I'm right in saying that attendance is reduced last year quite significantly. So I don't really believe the narrative that actually all cricketers are going to become guns to hire who are just going off and playing in these tournaments that we can't really remember. So I expect Test cricket to survive. I expect white ball tournaments still to be the pinnacle of white ball cricket. I expect it to continue to make money out of entertainment. I don't really see that being particularly different. What I do think we will start to see is the whole history of cricket to me is about batsmen being on top and bowlers being on top and batsmen being on top and bowlers being on top, and the reactions that they each take to each other.
Right.
So at the moment, fast bowlers are hugely in the ascendant.
Yeah.
And that situation doesn't usually persist for very long. Yeah. So there's going to be a correction somewhere along the line, I think. I think we've not seen an awful lot of good spinners emerging in other parts of the world, and I think they will have to.
Yeah.
But 10 years is an incredibly long time in cricket, Carters.
Yeah.
If we look back 10 years ago to 2009, I mean, what was going on then? The Australians had quite a weak bowling attack. India had a pretty weak seam bowling attack. England relied on Anderson and Broad, so there's nothing's changed there. The West Indies were in total disarray. New Zealand weren't particularly good. In a way, you might argue that 2009 was quite a sort of low watermark for cricket.
South Africa were about to be really good.
That's true.
Yeah.
South Africa were. I fear for South Africa. I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for cricket at the moment. But Brexit, which I'm not an enormous fan of, may help a bit because the Kolpak route, which I don't know how many people listening to this understand the vagaries of it, but the Kolpak ruling is essentially a European Union ruling, which allows the likes of Kyle Abbott and Duan Olafia and Hashim Amla, who's moving to Surrey, to play in England, but not be overseas players.
Yeah.
That route would be gone to them. So that might assist South African cricket in one way, but it won't deal with the structural problems that South African cricket's got, which is that it's not generating enough money to pay its players. So its players may then just instead end up playing an awful lot of T20 franchise cricket. So, I'm not sure I've really answered your question because I don't definitively know the answer. But if I did know the answer, then I'd be a rich man, wouldn't I?
Yeah. Well, I don't.
What do you think?
Well, I think the big structural fact governing cricket is that India is bigger than everybody else combined.
Yep.
And so I would really, if it was up to me, I would try to preserve Test cricket as a form of competition. But to do that, I would probably dismantle sort of the national representative side idea. Because it's just not sustainable. You cannot have one team representing 1 billion people and another team representing 5 million people and, have a sustainable competition indefinitely. You just can't, because, India was a big country 30 years ago, but in cricket terms, it was really 4 or 5 big cities and a few other towns, and that's not true anymore. And that's a huge advantage. And that's an unsustainable advantage, really. I hope they find a way to preserve the contest, which is basically 4 innings, unlimited overs, over a long enough period of time that, it is a competition between bat and ball. And they find a way to play that, and they find a way to make that professionally viable. Because right now, apparently, it is professionally viable, but other things are more apparently viable. So that, I think, is going to be the big question. How the ridiculously unsustainable inequality that is created when, one country is bigger than the 9 others combined. And now that is also an economic reality, right? Because for a long time, that was not an economic reality.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I have a lot of sympathy with it. I'd remind you that the 5 nations and 6 nations in rugby has been existing for a long time, and England is, of course, much larger than Wales, Scotland, and Ireland put together. It's not larger than France, but France plays rugby in smaller areas, and the same is true of Italy. And yet England doesn't always prosper in that environment, far from ordinarily prosper, because ultimately you've still got to pick 11 players, and you've got to make sure that you get those selections right. And being incredibly good at sport isn't just, if you look at New Zealand, for example, in rugby, they managed to maintain a dominant position in rugby for the best part of 100 years on a population of 5 or 6 million. So it's not ipso facto the case that cricket must become uncompetitive simply because a nation of 1 billion is playing in it. It requires you to identify the right talent, select the right talent. That talent needs to be able to adapt to the incredible pressures that are going to come from playing for a billion people and all the money that goes with that. So it's in many ways harder to play for India than it is to play for New Zealand or Sri Lanka or whatever. So that may sustain competition for a while, but I do take your sort of ultimate point, which is you've got to somehow sustain the form of cricket. That has to be a priority for us, because if we lose Test cricket, I don't think that in 50 years' time there'll be two people having this conversation with the same verve and gusto. Simply because I don't think other forms of cricket are as exciting. I mean, if all cricket was T20 cricket, I would probably be as interested in baseball as I am in cricket. Is that a terrible thing to say? That doesn't mean that I don't like T20 cricket. I happen to quite like baseball, but I don't think I would have become an obsessive. I don't think I'd have become a commentator. I don't think I'd have devoted my life to it if it was that. So, Test cricket is the thing that drags sentient, intelligent human beings away from the study of higher things into cricket, because Test cricket seems like the highest thing imaginable, both financially and in terms of talent, that it presents a challenge to how the rest of the game goes.
If you want to be a cricket fan, right? If you really want to be a cricket fan, and if you really find yourself thinking about cricket all the time, whenever you have free time, like the thing you think about is cricket. And I'll confess that this happens to me quite a bit. What should you be thinking about? Because I went through a phase where I would think about India and this and that, and now I don't think about that. And you've been at this longer than I have. So if I'm still doing this, and I probably will be in 10 years' time, what will I be thinking about?
Well, I think the things that we should always be thinking about, whether it's about cricket or anything else, is about who runs it, for what purposes.
Yeah.
It's about who's in charge and what their motivation is.
Yeah.
And at the moment, cricket is run with a sort of suggestion that it's for everybody, but it isn't. It's run for vested interests, and decisions are taken ultimately for the improvement of the BCCI's coffers.
Yeah.
And then after that, in roughly equal measure, the ECB and Cricket Australia. And then after that, there's a bunch of other cricketers. So what cricket needs to think about is the same question that Gideon Haigh has asked, and it's an apposite question. Does cricket exist to make money, or does it make money to exist?
Yeah.
And ask yourself, if it is the latter, which it surely is, does it make money to exist? How should it make that money, and how should it distribute that money, and how should it maintain clear and fair competition? Because there are many, many things that the English-speaking, I should say the British-centric world thinks about America.
Yeah.
Which is that it's brash and obsessed with supply and demand economics and sink or swim, and the American dream is all about, getting to the top, but it doesn't think about the people who are left behind. But what America does really well is appreciate that sport is a construct in which competition is absolutely vital in order to maintain excitement. You have to do that. They do that by ways and means that look slightly artificial to the foreign eye, with draft and what have you. And it seems slightly controlling, but it is a really successful way of maintaining a deep interest in baseball, American football being two really obvious examples. And cricket needs to understand and learn from that the curators of American sport they seem to have the interests of competition first and foremost in all the decisions that they make. And cricket doesn't. Cricket has the interests of bank balances and lovely houses and nice places to live and where you can get the most out of it from. And that's not the way to run a sport, I don't think. I don't think it's massively different from the issues that Jared Kimber and Sam Collins uncovered in their film Death of a Gentleman. I think they've gone away, and we will probably be talking about those again in 10 years' time. But it'd be lovely to think that we weren't. It'd be lovely to think that had been solved.
That's pretty much the founding question of everything, isn't it? I mean, do we live to make money, or do we make money to live? It is. On that note, Daniel, this has been a very great pleasure. Thank you for giving me 2.5 hours of your time.
No, it was a pleasure, an absolute pleasure, and all the very best and much love. And let's do it again when you've recovered from this.